I want to welcome you to the webinar for May 17th, 2016. Today you will hear ISO 20022 use cases for U.S. wire transfer systems. I'm Amy Vaughn with the Federal Reserve, and I'll be your facilitator. I'm happy to welcome our presenter today, Gina Russo. Gina is Assistant Vice President of Payment Product Management for the Federal Reserve System. Before I turn it over to Gina, I just want to review the logistics for this call. Hopefully you've joined us via the webinar, but if you haven't done so yet, you can click on the webinar link you received after registering. This option offers a few benefits. You can watch the slides as they are advanced. You can type questions to us. Just click that Ask Question button you see and type them to us, and we'll get them to the presenter. We will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. There is a materials button. You can download the presentation there. You can also listen to your audio through your PC speakers. Please note that the webinar performance depends on your connection. So if at any time you're having problems, just pick up the phone and dial the toll-free number. If your slides aren't advancing, you can press F5 on your keyboard to refresh your page. Now, with all that out of the way, we're ready for our presenter to take over. Gina, the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you, Amy. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gina Russo from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and I work in the Wholesale Product Office, which manages the FedWire Fund Service. So thank you for joining today's webinar. We're going to focus today's discussion on ISO 20022 use cases for wire transfer systems in the U.S., so we will not be talking about ISO adoption for ACH systems. However, I do want to note that there are efforts underway within the Federal Reserve for the ACH systems in the U.S., and if you're interested in seeing what's going on in ACH, you can go to the fedpaymentsimprovement.org website, and there we have a dedicated page for ISO 20022 information, and so we've included information on both what's going on with wire transfers as well as ACH. And on that webpage, you can also see webinars that we did last year that provide more general background about what ISO 20022 is, and a business case assessment that we did in the U.S. to determine whether or not we should adopt ISO for payment systems in the U.S. So you can get a lot of helpful background information on this effort if you go to that website. So turning to the table of contents on slide 2, just to give you a sense of what we'll cover today, we're going to start by going through an executive summary, which is essentially just summarizing at a high level the main themes that we're going to touch on when we go through the detailed use cases. And you'll see here on slide 2 we have 8 detailed use cases that we're going to discuss. And then at the end, there's an appendix which shows the ISO 20022 adoption efforts for high-value payment systems around the world, so you could get a sense to see where other markets are around the world. You'll see that some have already adopted ISO, and then others have plans underway. And then finally, in Appendix 2, we just show you a very brief example to show you the difference between the current legacy format for wire transfer systems and then what it would look like in the ISO 20022 format, so you can take a look at that. But as I mentioned earlier, if you want to hear more background about what ISO is and the benefits of ISO, you can listen to webinars that we did last year. So now turning to slide 4, we're going to go right into the executive summary. So at the outset, I just want to let everyone know that the adoption of ISO 20022 messages for U.S. wire transfer systems, it really is a strategic imperative in the U.S., and it's really no longer a question of if, but of when and how we're going to do it. So in terms of when, the Fed and the Clearinghouse have announced a high-level strategy to begin the conversion to ISO messages for both the inputs and outputs of our wire transfer systems beginning in 2020. And I'll talk a little bit more of the timeline in a little bit, but our plan and our intention is that we would begin the conversion to ISO in 2020, and I'll talk about how we plan to accomplish that later. In terms of how, what we're going to be doing is that we each plan to implement mandated phases for conversion to ISO. So at some point, we are going to sunset our legacy format and only support the ISO 20022 messages. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. So turning to the next slide, 5. So in terms of strategic reasons of why we're adopting ISO for wire transfers, so we did a business case assessment last year. We had an independent consultant come and look at, reasons for adoption. And there really wasn't a financial business case, but there were strategic business reasons that we should adopt ISO. And really, it all relates to investing in the future, to modernize our wire formats, to help us meet increasing demands for richer data, complying with evolving regulatory requirements, improving interoperability given a global economy, and the ability to provide enhanced services to clients. And so the ISO 20022 format has characteristics that can help U.S. payment markets meet these needs. So in terms of providing richer data, ISO, as you'll see when we walk through the use cases, it contains structured fields to support longer names and specific address components, including a country code. And these things can help reduce data loss and improve regulatory screening. It also supports structured format for extended remittance information, which could improve straight-through processing for corporate business-to-business payments. Moving to the next slide, 6. The ISO 20022 format can also help to promote domestic and cross-border interoperability. So in the U.S. today, we have a proprietary message format for both the Fedwire Fund Service and CHIPS. So while these formats are mappable, they are proprietary, and so banks that participate in both systems have to maintain separate formats for each system, as well as banks that also participate in SWIFT. There's a separate format for the SWIFT networking system. So, having to maintain all of those different formats causes issues with interoperability. And moving to a common format can promote ease of transacting domestically and globally using a single standard. ISO also contains fields that are common across the suite of payment messages, so it helps payment information be carried end-to-end throughout the payment chain. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but there's a set of messages to support both the payment initiation process, the interbank settlement process, and then the reporting process. And then as we learned when we did our business case assessment in 2014, we learned that other markets around the world, including those of U.S. trading partners, have either gone live with ISO or are in development stages of implementing ISO. And as I mentioned earlier, we have a summary of that in Appendix 1 of this slide deck. The ISO 20022 format also could provide opportunities to improve existing processes or add new services, as I mentioned here on slide 6. Turning now to slide 7. So in terms of the negative use case, so we took a look at, what could happen if we don't adopt ISO and we just keep things the way they are and maintain our legacy formats. What the concern is that as other markets around the world adopt ISO and move to a common global format, we worry that the U.S. payment systems could fall behind the rest of the world and be possibly perceived as being outdated, and that could lead to a degradation of the U.S. dollar leadership as a global settlement currency. And we're also concerned about encouraging migration of U.S. dollar clearing offshore to either other currencies or emerging payment systems built with new technologies. Turning to the next slide, slide 8. So now we're going to take a look at the timeline that we've announced for adopting ISO for the wire systems in the U.S. And I will start by saying that this is a very preliminary high-level timeline. We have a lot more detailed work to do before we can really ensure that we can meet these dates. but this is the timeline that we're striving for at this point. And so you'll see on the left of the slide here. So right now we're embarking on the detailed planning activities, which we envision continuing into 2017. And I listed here on slide 8, the types of things that we're going to be doing with the detailed planning. So we'll be defining our project teams and working on our detailed project plans and really trying to finalize the timelines. We're going to be working on customer communications, and for those of you on the call that are direct Fedwire Funds participants, you'll know that we sent you a communication in March to announce our intention to adopt ISO, and in that communication we included this timeline. A big part of the detailed planning is that, doing the detailed mapping to ensure that the ISO format can accommodate everything in the Fedwire and CHIPS formats. And, we may be able to identify things that are no longer needed that we could eliminate. And we also may identify things that we need to add to the ISO format to accommodate things that are necessary for the U.S. wire transfer system. So that's really where the bulk of our work will be over the next year. And we also want to collaborate with the industry to identify and prioritize enhancements that we can include in our ISO implementation, because feedback we've heard so far from the industry is that if we are going to make such a change, that we should do so by including enhancements, so that we don't just do a like-for-like implementation, but that we do implement something to support enhancements as well. So really, all of this work will lead us to creating a message implementation guide that we would then announce to the industry in 2017. And so this is where we would be giving the industry, so banks and vendors, the specifications that they need to start coding their systems to support Fedwire and CHIPS. And then we envision in 2018, everyone would be going back, including ourselves. We would be doing the detailed development work and the internal testing of our systems to accommodate the new format. Then in 2019, both the Fed and the clearinghouse, we would open up our customer testing environment so that customers and vendors could start testing the ISO messages with our systems. And then here in 2020, we're envisioning that that's when we would begin the production rollout to ISO. And the way we're envisioning it is that, it'll be a phased conversion. And you'll see here at the end of the timeline, we have a TBD, because we're not sure when all of this will be complete and when we'll actually sunset the legacy format. But what we're envisioning is that in 2020, both the Fed and the clearinghouse, we would be, so banks would continue to send us the legacy format, and then the Fed and CHIPS, we would convert it to ISO, and then we would deliver the ISO format to banks that are capable of receiving ISO. And we would be cutting over our customers in phases to receive the ISO. And for the Fed, we have thousands of customers, so we don't want to do a big bang approach, meaning we don't want to cut over everyone on the same day. So we're envisioning, grouping banks into buckets, and then we would be converting them in phases to receive ISO. And then once all of our customers are capable of receiving the ISO format, then we would begin converting banks over to sending ISO. And then once a bank starts sending ISO, they will no longer send the legacy format. And then once we, finish that phase where everyone is sending ISO, then we will sunset our legacy proprietary format. So again, a lot more work needs to be done in order to really finalize our rollout plan and the timelines. But this is, at a high level, is what we're thinking in terms of our rollout of the ISO messages. So moving on to the next slide, slide 9. So in conclusion, again, this is just showing, this is our executive summary here. What we're saying is, we know, the U.S. has long led the international payments market, and we've actively participated in the development of the next generation of messaging standards. We know that other payments markets are either live with ISO or they're planning to go live with ISO. And again, that's where we reference that Appendix 1 at the end of this document. And, as you've heard today, the Fed and the Clearinghouse, we're committed to begin the conversion to ISO as early as 2020. Again, we have a lot more work to do to finalize this timeline, but we are targeting 2020 to begin the conversion. And then we also want to, make sure that we continue to engage in global efforts to make sure that we ensure interoperability and that our implementation of ISO is consistent with how other markets are implementing ISO so that we can, again, ensure that interoperability. So that concludes the executive summary, and really the intention of that is that for those that want to go back within your organizations and talk to your senior leaders to kind of give them a sense of, why is the Fed and the Clearinghouse doing this? It kind of gives you an executive summary overview to give you a sense of the strategic reasons we're moving in this direction. So now we're going to walk through the detailed use cases, which begin on slide 11. So you'll see here on slide 11. So before I go through them, I just want to give you a sense of how we structure the use cases. So you'll see each slide has a new use case. We're going to go over 8 use cases, and you'll see that the name of the use case is in the first column, and then the middle column, what we're trying to do is define the limitations of the current wire formats. And then in the third column, we're trying to show you the benefits of ISO and how, ISO can help, deal with the limitations that we've identified. So the first use case, we're calling the compliance with domestic and regulatory requirements. And really, we made this use case the first use case because we felt that this is something that banks of all sizes could relate to because every bank has to deal with regulatory requirements and, to ensure they're doing proper OFAC and AML screening and whatnot. So, the current legacy formats for Fedwire and chips. So as an example, in terms of limitations, so the name field in the current format is limited to 35 characters. And what this can lead to is either data truncation if the name is longer than 35 characters. So either a bank will have to truncate that, or what they may do, and what they probably likely do because they don't want to truncate, is they carry that over into other free text fields within the format. And banks are doing this differently, so there's no consistent way of handling this situation. And so that's one issue. In the ISO format, one of the benefits is that it does accommodate longer names. So the name field in ISO can accommodate up to 140 characters, which should in most cases handle, this name truncation issue. And this is an important issue because when you're doing your OFAC screening and AML screening, you're looking for specific names. So if the name is broken up into multiple fields, you may miss some of your, it may cause issues with your screening. Another issue with the current proprietary format is that the address fields are just simply free text lines of 35 characters each. And we actually show this example in Appendix 2 of the slide deck. So we show, how the free text looks in Fedwire and chips today. And then in ISO, we compare it to how the address would look in the ISO format, where the ISO format has discrete fields to carry address information. So it's broken up into, there's one field for the street number, there's another field for the street name and the town name and the state and the zip code, and it also has a country code. And having a country code is definitely helpful for, even doing data analytics, but it's also helpful with screening because you're looking for sanctioned countries, and having that discrete code could really help with the screening. So that really takes care of the compliance with regulatory requirements use case. So the next slide, moving on to the next use case. This one we're calling domestic and cross-border interoperability. And I touched on this earlier when I went through the executive summary of how both the FedWire and CHIPS formats and the SWIFT format, we all have separate formats, and while even though they are mostly interoperable, they aren't exact, and they each do have their own unique field tag names and characteristics. And what happens is that banks that participate in more than one system, they must maintain mapping routines to ensure the data is being mapped correctly between the systems. And then global banks, they also need to ensure they can map to other systems outside of the U.S. to support cross-border payments. And then it's further complicated that whenever wire format changes are made, especially SWIFT, they make message format changes every year. Banks are going to have to update all of their systems or develop market conventions for mapping to and from all the systems that have changed. Another issue that we know is on the horizon is that SWIFT has announced that they're going to eliminate the free format options in their ordering customer and beneficiary customer fields. So they're only going to support the structured format in the SWIFT MT format. But the ISO format already does that, and so, since we're moving to ISO, we don't want to have banks having to make, the other changes to accommodate the SWIFT MT format as well. And so having a consistent format, will close the gaps between the different systems and hopefully reduce data truncation. Hopefully, over time, it will reduce cost in maintaining all these mapping routines and market conventions, and then also cost associated with maintaining different MT formats. It could hopefully reduce those costs. Moving on to the next use case. So the next use case we're calling the negative business case. And again, I touched on this earlier when in the executive summary. And really what we're saying is here is that, as other markets outside of the U.S. adopt ISO, banks and their corporate customers engaged in global trade are going to need to make system changes to accommodate ISO in those markets. And so if the lack of cross-border interoperability, if the U.S. does not also move towards ISO as other markets are doing so, it could lead to a perception that the U.S. is an outlier with an outdated payment system. It could make the U.S. dollar become less attractive as a global currency. It could increase the risk of migrating U.S. dollar clearing to offshore clearing arrangements. And then it could also lead to counterparties deciding to conduct transactions in other currencies in markets that have already migrated to ISO. And so moving towards a common global format could modernize the payment message formats with a common data dictionary that can be used across different message suites and business domains. As I mentioned earlier, there are ISO messages to support the end-to-end payment flow. It could make it easier for global banks and corporates to conduct transactions across different markets. It could reduce the cost associated with maintaining the multiple formats today. And then again, it could prevent the migration of dollar payments migrating to offshore clearing arrangements. Moving to the next slide, slide 14. So the next use case we're calling the single end-to-end payment file format. So our understanding is in today's world on the payment origination side, some corporations are sending commingled payment files to instruct their banks to make various payment types. So, they could send a single file, and in the file it'll say they want some payments to go wire, some to go ACH, some to go check. And then when the banks get in these files, they have to convert the instructions to the appropriate format for the respective system. So today they have to convert it to a wire format, the NACHA format for the ACH systems, and then whatever format the check systems support. And so then on the payment receipt side, banks need to be able to receive different file formats from the wire transfer systems, and then convert that into other formats to deliver payment information to the beneficiaries. So you can see how there's a lot of mapping and converting from one format to another format. And in the ISO format, it has sufficient data fields to support a single uniform file for high value, low value, and emerging real-time systems. So it's really payment type agnostic. It includes all, a robust data dictionary that could accommodate the needs of different payment systems. And it also has fields that are common across the suite of ISO payment messages, so that the same information can be carried end to end. And I've mentioned this before. So there's a set of ISO messages called the PAIN messages, P-A-I-N, and they are the payment initiation. So those are the messages that a corporate would send their bank. And we know a lot of the global corporations today are already sending these PAIN messages to their banks today. And really what the banks are doing is then they're converting that into the legacy formats. So moving to ISO for the interbank settlement process, so the bank-to-bank process, and these are the messages that would be carried over Fedwire and chips. So the interbank ISO messages are called the PACS messages, the payment and clearing and settlement messages, the PACS. And so if we were to move to ISO for the wire systems, when the banks get in these PAIN messages, it would be easy for them to then just send them over the Fedwire and chip systems as PACS messages, because the same data can be carried in from the PAIN into the PACS. And then in terms of the cash management side, so this is from the bank to their corporate client, they're called CAMT messages, the CAMT messages. And so, again, these messages have the fields that, are in the PAIN and the PACS messages, and then the banks could simply, send those messages to their corporate clients. So, again, it's facilitating that end-to-end payment flow without having to do all of this mapping and converting into all these different formats. And so this could allow corporations and their banks and intermediaries to exchange payments in the same format regardless of the type of system they are using to process the payment. So moving to the next slide, slide 15. This use case is focused on a consistent format for extended remittance information. So as many of you know, in the U.S. today, there is no uniform format for extended remittance information. And so ACH systems are using both legacy ERI formats. So they use EDI or STPA20, and they do support XML and ISO 20022 messages as well. For the Fed and the clearinghouse, we both implemented extended remittance information capabilities in our wire formats in November 2011, but adoption has been limited. And so what we think is that numerous ERI formats are preventing the uptake of ERI in a consistent way because banks, corporations, and their vendors need to make changes to support and maintain each format. So, while we did implement ERI in our legacy formats in November 2011, it's really not being used, and we suspect that it's really because, it's just one more, format to maintain, and, it just doesn't make sense for banks to have to make the necessary changes to support it. However, moving towards a common format like ISO 20022, it could provide it does provide a consistent structured format to carry ERI with the payment message, and it supports the end-to-end payment flow from the originator to the beneficiary. So that could enable to make the adoption of ERI easier, and it could also increase the likelihood that when an originator sends the ERI, the beneficiary can receive and process it. Because if we're moving to this common format, For the wire systems in the middle, the banks, could make the necessary changes to make it available to their corporate clients on the send side as well as the receipt side. ISO has also created a standalone remittance advice message. It's called the REMT. And this is really for banks that would want to deliver remittance information outside of the payment. So, the REMT would not be carried over Fedwire or CHIPS, but it is something that's available today if banks wanted to, send the remittance information from their corporate customer to the ultimate beneficiary. Moving on to the next slide, slide 16. So this use case is end-to-end payment tracking. And so in the current formats today, each party to a payment transaction has limited visibility into the end-to-end transaction flow to ensure that payment was successfully processed from the originator to the beneficiary. And in the ISO payment and cash management messages, there is an end-to-end ID, and there's structured messages to support status messages and return messages, and it makes it easier to support real-time payment tracking and reporting, which could provide a revenue opportunity for banks to offer these type of services to their customers. It could also enable a central utility to provide banks and their customers with information about the status of their payments. So while we could maybe make changes to our legacy formats to support this, the ISO format already has fields and characteristics that would make it easier to enable end-to-end payment tracking. And then moving to the last business or use case on slide 17. So this use case we're calling the next generation workforce. And the limitation of the current formats is that, as seasoned format experts either change jobs or retire, maintaining staff with the expertise on the legacy proprietary formats becomes challenging and costly, whereas the ISO format is in XML, which is a modern language. It's become mainstream. It's easy to use with modern programming tools. And so, upgrading to a common XML-based format for payment messages could make it easier to attract and retain resources and expand the knowledge base of formatting experts in the payments industry. And then, we do have one more use case. I think I said this last one was the last one, but we have one more on slide 18. So this use case we're calling enhanced corporate capabilities. Now, really, this, and I won't really go into it in detail, but because it really repeats a lot of everything I've already said in the other use cases, but what we try to do here is bring forward the common themes that would be applicable to corporates. And so when banks are taking a look at this, or corporates are even looking at it, they could kind of see in one slide the limitations of the current formats, and then how ISO can benefit them and address those limitations. So it's, again, repeating the same things about, the fact that we have multiple message formats today. We don't have a standard way to support ERI. We know that some large corporates are already demanding that their banks support them with XML messages for payment initiation and cash management. And then again, talking about the benefits that we've already discussed, the ISO having discrete structured fields, more capacity. It has, it supports common fields across the suite to support the end-to-end payment flow. It could improve straight-through processing. It could make it easier for global corporates to conduct transactions across different markets. It has messages that support all different payment streams, trade financing, electronic bank account management, bank services billing. It could support the single payment file that we talked about. It could reduce costs associated with maintaining multiple formats. It could enable the end-to-end payment tracking that we talked about. And we do know that it's already supported by some enterprise resource planning systems and treasury management systems. So we know that ISO is out there already in a lot of systems. And, as we move towards a common standard, it will, slowly but surely move the market towards a common standard. And, we know that this is not a short-term solution. This is really a strategic decision. We probably won't see the benefits immediately. It'll be a longer-term benefits. But we think over time it will increase efficiencies, allow banks to provide richer data services to their clients, and over time will reduce cost and because it will increase efficiencies. So that really concludes my webinar for today, and hopefully this gave you some helpful insights into the benefits of ISO. Again, these are what we've identified as use cases. There may be others out there. Hopefully your institution can relate to some of them. And at this point, I'd be happy to take some questions.
Thanks, Gina. I will let everyone get a few seconds to collect their thoughts and get their questions into our webinar tool. Just click that Ask Question button, type them in, and we will route those to Gina. Our first question that has come in is, can you remind us when all U.S. financial institutions will be required to comply with ISO 20022?
Okay, yes. So as I mentioned on the timeline slide, we plan to begin our conversion to ISO in 2020. And again, I will restate that this is a high-level preliminary timeline. This is our target. We have a lot more work to do to ensure that we can meet this deadline. But as of now, our targeted date is 2020. So when you think about it, if you look at the timeline, if we deliver, you should be expecting us to deliver a format specification to you in 2017. And then that's when you would begin, doing your own programming and internal development work to ready your systems to support ISO, so that you would be in a position to start testing with us in the 2019 timeframe. And then, again, in 2020, that's when we would start converting banks to receive the ISO format. And
Thank you.
Will say, I just want to add one other thing.
Mm-hmm.
So we will be in regular communication with the Fedwire customers and vendors, as well as posting updates to the fedpaymentsimprovement.org website. So, we'll be in a lot of communication to make sure that we keep everyone informed of our progress. And if I can tell you we will not be making the timeline earlier. So we'll be keeping you updated on where we stand with our ability to meet the target. And if we change any of the dates, we would be communicating to you through various forums. So I'll take the next question.
Thanks, Gina. Prior to ISO 20022 implementation, how can a financial institution handle richer data with limited space?
So, I'm not sure if I fully understand the question, but I will say that our current Fedwire and CHIPS format, it already supports extended remittance information. So we already have discrete fields in there to support the ERI, which could allow for the richer data. So, but it would require you to make changes to your systems to be able to support the sending and receiving of the extended remittance information. And so now that we're moving towards ISO, I'm not sure if you have not already invested in those changes if you would, want to do so, but we do support it today. In terms of richer data around like address information, we do have in our originator field today, we do have it's our 5010 tag, and that provides a little bit more structure to the address because it's equivalent to the SWIFT field 50, their option F format. That helps a little bit with the structured data around the address, but it's definitely not as robust as what ISO could provide. So I'm not sure if that addresses your question, but perhaps it's somewhat helpful.
Sounds good. The next question. There seems to be multiple versions of ISO 20022, even though it's a single standard. Given this, how do we achieve ubiquity and interoperability?
Okay, so this is a great question, and this is something that, I think I mentioned, probably very quickly on the conclusion slide that the Fed and the clearinghouse are going to be staying on top of what's going on globally, and SWIFT is actually leading a group of market infrastructures around the world that are looking at how is everyone adopting ISO, because we want to do it in a consistent way in order to maintain the interoperability. So it's definitely, we are aware that, if we don't stay on top of what each other is doing, we're not going to be able to achieve the interoperability that we hope to achieve with ISO. So it's definitely on the top of our minds, and we are, as we decide how we're going to implement ISO on our systems, we will be taking into consideration how other markets around the world have already done it. And then for markets that haven't done it yet, we're going to be coordinating with them so that we can all kind of come to a common approach. And SWIFT is really facilitating this type of work for us. They're engaging the market infrastructures around the world to coordinate and collaborate on this issue.
Okay, and this one goes along with that. Which countries do you think have taken advantage of the benefits of ISO already, and which are most advanced in the adoption?
So we know if you turn to Appendix 1 in the slide deck, we've identified the other markets around the world that have already adopted ISO. So as an example, in Japan, the BOJ net system, which is equivalent to a Fedwire system, they've adopted it, and they've been live really only since October 2015. But what we plan to do is reach out to them to determine, what they did and look at, what benefits are they realizing. And I think really the realization of the benefits is probably more longer term. It's probably not going to happen overnight, because at first it is going to be very costly to get everyone to make the changes necessary to support the new format. And then over time, it's really when you're going to see those benefits, when you're going to be able to start, offering more services to your customers and maybe, getting some revenue opportunities there, and hopefully seeing cost efficiencies where you're not having to maintain all these formats. There's always going to be some level of mapping going on, but hopefully moving to a more common format will reduce, if not eliminate it, but at least reduce the mapping required, and hopefully over time that would achieve some cost efficiencies and some benefits in terms of that. But it's probably going to be a more longer-term type of thing.
Thanks, Gina.
Any other questions?
Let's give everybody one more chance. Click that Ask Question button in the webinar. Type your questions to us, and we will get those over to Gina. Doesn't look like we have any coming in on this time. Let me refresh real quick. I don't see any questions at this time, but do remember that you can download this presentation. There's also a materials button right next to the Ask Question button. You'll get a PDF of the slides that Gina covered today. We want to thank you for joining us, and thanks to Gina for all her work on this session. And any other questions that you have, you can send them to Fed Payments Improvement at chi.frb.org, and someone will get back to you. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great day.